we just start to develop this ISMR. The target of ISMR is to change those power levels 5% per minute. And it's a similar level of combined gas power plant. So you can do this with the large power plant, but if we want, you can more rapidly power changes in the SMR. That is very important because we expect this future electricity grid will consist of much large amount of renewables. I mean, this intermittent, like the solar and wind, with some nuclear and other energy sources. So flexibility is very key issues in the future electricity system. So what are the challenges developing those SMR or commercialization of SMR? First thing is licensing issues. Because of different design features which we adopt on the SMR design, the regulatory bodies, they hesitate to license those SMRs because they should be very conservative. So they should secure all the safety and securities. So we need some modernization or update of the regulatory systems which are good for this SMR. And the other things I already mentioned, we improve these economics of SMR. And third thing is we still have some problems to persuade general publics that give them some confidence to nuclear is safe. So even though SMR is safer than the existing nuclear power plant, but we still need to communications and persuade those general publics to dispatch SMR. And let me briefly explain this SMR development here in Korea. 1997, we start to develop these so-called integrated small modular reactors. The name is SMART, and the idea is originated from those integrated reactor. I'm not sure some of you are maybe familiar with this severe accident of nuclear power plant, like the Fukushima accident in Japan. One of the most fragile parts of those nuclear power plants is pipelines. Once those pipelines break down, all this coolant, I mean, in that case, it's water, it's just going out very rapidly. And without those waters, those cooling waters, the core temperature will increase very rapidly and it will melt down. That makes the big problem. So many nuclear engineers think about how we can remove those situations by design. And one of that idea is, okay, we will remove all the pipelines in the nuclear power plant. So the idea is we will integrate all those reactors and pumpers, steam generators, all in the one cask. That is integrated reactors. So that can be designed only in the SMR size. If we want to introduce those designs in the large power plant, like the 1,000 megawatt electrics, then you should make very, very big, huge size of caskets or reactor vessels. It will not be manufactured by any manufacturers in the world. So the size, because of those size limits, those integral concepts only applied for this SMR design. So Korea is, I'm very proudly say, Korea is the first mover to design those integral type SMR development. In the very beginning stage, we start develop those projects. It's called developing SMART. Nobody is so sure to SMR will become very popular because it's quite expensive than a large power plant, and it's more complicated to manufacture, and we don't have proper regulatory systems. With those decades of researches, we will get standard design approval from Korean regulatory bodies in year 2012, just 1 year after Fukushima Daiichi accident. So once we got those SDA, then we want to demonstrate those smart design in Korea. But as you can imagine, but the very next year of Fukushima accident, nobody want to build a nuclear power plant in any place. So we failed to demonstrate those smart design at the time. And we had some discussions on those demonstration with outside of Korea. You can see these diagrams on SMART. As I already mentioned, this integrated design. You can see here, every component is only one in the one reactor vessels. And we had some discussions with some Middle East countries, especially for Saudi Arabia, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and we have some cooperations with the Saudi Arabia to demonstrate smart reactor. So that's why we developed this as smart for the dual purpose, for electricity generation and also seawater desalination. So the size is 100 megawatt. 90% of electricity will be used for the electricity consumption, and 10% of electricity will be used for these desalinations. That is fit into 100,000 populations use. Now we have, well, let me elaborate some designs on the SMART. At the time, for those regulation restrict, we have to combine those innovative concept with some proven technologies. We introduced some innovative concept, as I already mentioned, this some integrated concept. That's some sort of these new approaches. And we also introduced some proven technologies. We didn't change any fuel specifications. When you develop the new nuclear reactors, the most time-consuming work is developing new fuel, because this nuclear fuel is very critical for those safeties. So you need, once you develop the nuclear fuels, and you have to burn out on the reactors. It's like some chicken and egg problems. You developed your nuclear fuels for using new reactors, but regulatory bodies always asked you need to some irradiation test on your reactor. So what we can solve those problems. So that's why we need some research reactor to for those irradiation tests. And mostly it takes at least 3 to 5 years just for the irradiations. So once we introduce new nuclear fuels, it requires at least 10 years. Sometimes it requires 20 years. So that's why we use the conventional fuels at the time. Now we will get, okay, we are running out of time. Well, now we submit advanced, modified smart design to our regulatory bodies, and we expect to get some issuance of SDA by Nuclear Safety and Security Commission in Korea in the middle of next year. Let me jump to the next version of SMART. It is called ISMR, already mentioned. And government of Korea approved those developing those ISMR project this June. And it will develop to get the SDA by year 2028. So what are these? It requires some design features. We scale up those power levels up to 170 megawatt from 100 megawatt of SMART. because of economy of scales. So even in the SMRs, the bigger power means the more economical. Also, we will achieve this safety to the maximum levels. So core damage frequency is below 10 to minus 9. So it's one of the highest, targets in the world. Well, we don't have that much time. Probably if you are interested in the ISMR, probably I will have some explanation during Q&A sessions or after these sessions. So I already mentioned we have a target to get this SDA by 2028. So you can refer to those maps. Let me briefly touch upon those non-LWR type SMR development in Korea. Well, since 1990s, Carrie is developing those so-called sodium-cooled fast reactor, which using the fast neutron spectrums. It means you can burn out your spent nuclear fuels in that reactor. So we are developing those SFR for this TRU burner. It means we want to burn out all those TRU elements from the spent nuclear fuel in that reactor. Those design is almost finished. And the problem is we cannot find out any demonstration places. So we start a new project which is called development of SALUS, which is some modification of conventional SFR design to electricity generation. And the original, the plutonium burner, TRU burner is 150 megawatt electric capacity, and we scale down to the 100 megawatt for those electric generation for this longer fuel cycle period. And we are expecting to submit those vendor design review to Canadian regulators in this year. And another reactor is VHTR, very high temperature reactors. Actually, this is not very, it's a high temperature reactors. Our target temperature, outlet temperature is 750 degrees of Celsius, which is ideal for those high temperature electrolysis for hydrogen production. And now we have some cooperation with the United States cooperation, which is called the USNC, who are carrying out this demonstration project in Canada to demonstrate those types of reactors. And we support them. And Hyundai Engineering also joined that project. So we hope once the USNC demonstrate those type of reactor in Canada, then we will import that technologies to Korea to hydrogen production with some modifications. And the last one is molten salt reactor. This is one of the hottest technologies in the nuclear field recently. I think over 30 startups who want to develop this MSR in the worldwide, because this technology is very ideal and very unique features. It's a liquefied fuels. It uses liquefied fuels. It's very new ideas, because most of nuclear power plant use solid fuels, but in this case using the liquid fuels. And it is very good for these small reactors. So we developed this MSR for these maritime applications, especially for these engines for these container ships. And so we have a cooperation with some heavy industries in ship makers in Korea. Well, yeah, I think it's a brief introduction of our developing stages. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Lim. Thank you for helping me keep time. Okay, and I will give him some more time during our discussion session to explain about ISMR. So now we will move to our next presenter, Dr. Brian Boyer. He is the section head of the International Project on Innovative Nuclear Reactor and Fuel Cycle, so-called INPRO, in the IAEA's Department of Nuclear Energy. He was a safeguards analyst in the IAEA Department of Safeguards from 2015 to 2019. Previously, he was a safeguards expert at Los Alamos and Brookhaven National Laboratory. In fact, he has a long career in nuclear safeguards, and he's a very famous expert in this field. And I hope the time in Vienna is not that early. Okay, now floor is yours, Brian.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lee. Good to see you again. Good to see you, Dr. Yin. Nice to meet you, Dr. Kim there. Lee, I would share my screen now.
Yes,
With
please.
you?
Yes. We cannot see it
There.
yet.
Sharing. You see it?
It's coming.
Not yet.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, we can see it.
You see?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay. So, thank you. So the topic, of course, of this conference is promoting nuclear nonproliferation for the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Now, we're in the international project on innovative nuclear reactors and fuel cycles, known as NPRO. And while we're not safeguards, we're very much a cross-cutting project. So I'm going to title my talk today, IAEA NPRO Issues for the Innovation and the Future of Nuclear Power Development, which crisscrosses a number of very interesting topics that in fact, our two previous speakers have already spoken about. I'm going to just do an overview of our NPRO methodology. Two key parts of what NPRO does is analysis versus assessment. Then I'm going to look into the definition of proliferation resistance. I'm talking about a little bit about our major effort on proliferation resistance manual, where we've revised it, where we have a group of experts from around the globe in proliferation resistance, physical protection working group people, some academics, and it's a global effort. There are Americans, Russians, Japanese, Canadians, Germans, all involved in this effort. The idea being that we have a expert opinion, but it's considered a global expert opinion consensus. So we tried to make sure it's not all tipped in one area. And also there's been a major effort this year to get into the 3S, safety, security, safeguards. We've started a working group there through our nuclear safety people. We are engaged as NPRO because we're cross-cutting, and also the 3SBD, Safeguards by Design. There's been a Safeguards by Design working group, but now we're getting more integration of the different parts of our house in the IAEA to work together on these concepts, which has been a very fruitful effort. And I have to say, my colleagues in the other departments have been excellent to work with. We're working together for one goal. Now, as I mentioned, the keystone of NPRO is that we do analysis versus assessment. We have what is called ASNUS, Analysis Support for Enhanced Nuclear Energy Sustainability. It's part of our task one. And what we do is we have tools there to model nuclear energy evolution scenarios, economics, comparative evaluation of a nuclear energy system or scenario alternatives, and road mapping for looking at nuclear energy sustainability. We have a bunch of tools there. And in fact, we're trying to develop a tool called FRAMES, which involves a lot of the economic issues and sustainability issues with respect to nuclear, with renewables, fossil, and the others. A lot of what Shannon has been talking about earlier. In fact, one of her proteges, Francesco Ganda, was the key creator of this effort. And we want to try and integrate that into our analysis. Analysis looking at different systems, making comparisons. Now, assessment, we're taking a look at a specific system. For example, we have this SMR NISA, Nuclear Energy System Assessment, and the Republic of Korea is partaking in that, and they have a team from SMART, and they're looking at SMART, assessing SMART with respect to economics, safety, infrastructure, environment, proliferation resistance, and waste management. And we've developed a support package there, which includes the manuals that provide the backbone, the framework for doing an assessment. Now, with our info methodologies, we're worried about a number of key issues. We figure there's 7 key issues there that are covered in our manuals. Nuclear accident risk, which of course we were just discussing, and the issues that all came up with Fukushima. Accident risk, how to minimize them. Economics, as we were talking about with Shannon and also the next speaker. And proliferation risk, which I'm going to try and deal with a little bit more in detail on what we're trying to do. Because I know I've had conversations with Dr. Yim on this, and he wanted to get these ideas out in front of everybody. And a key thing is institutions and public acceptability. There needs to be sufficient institutional support and public acceptability of nuclear power. Radioactive waste disposal. We actually have some tasks here that are trying to look at advanced reactors, advanced reactor fuel cycles, and focus on waste from them. Because there are a lot of people have these great ideas about a nuclear reactor, but are they prepared on the front end with the fuels, and are they prepared in the back end with disposal, storage, or recycling of such fuels? So we're trying to at least bring these, INPO tries to bring topics out and find where the gaps are so that experts can take a look at them and solve them. Then of course, health, environmental risk are a key piece of what we look at. This methodology is sustainability assessment versus analysis. So in our assessment, we're looking at sustainability over a time frame. We're trying to look over a century, except waste management decommissioning, which can go a lot further, because you're always going to have to handle that. But one of the reasons is to project over a long period of time, because technologies could change over a century. Perhaps there could be technologies for recycling that are created in the next 10, 20, 30 years that can make recycling economic, efficient, clean, rather reliable way of operating the back end of the fuel cycle. It could all be in the laboratories being developed today. And the other thing is what costs and available alternative supplies could be different. Just look at the changes in the energy cost in the last year, how things can flip around. In fact, we did some analysis on that, and you can see immediately that in some areas, the use of nuclear power becomes more advantageous and economical. We have a pyramid of looking at things. We look at basic principles, goals for sustainable development. And then we have a set of user requirements. These are the actions to meet the goal. And then we have the assessor's tools. So when you're assessing it, you have certain criteria to take a look at what's going on in your cycle. Now, with respect to the proliferation resistance piece there, we base a lot of what we do on this definition that came out 20 years ago at the meeting in Como, where proliferation resistance was defined by a number of experts from the agency and beyond. So proliferation resistance is a characteristic of a nuclear system that impedes diversion or undeclared production of nuclear material or misuse of technology by states in order to acquire nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. A little bit similar to some of the definitions that the Safeguards Department is using to evaluate the state of nuclear material use and the safeguards goals in the state nowadays that expand beyond just taking a look at diversion. So you're evaluating a system with respect to this sentence here. So where we go in the proliferation resistance manual, and this paragraph here, and I've highlighted it with colors because they're very important to us that people understand. There's intrinsic features and extrinsic measures, and they need to be implemented through the full life cycle for a nuclear energy system. So you ensure that the nuclear energy system will be an unattractive means to acquire fissile material for a nuclear weapons program. Hence, it has proliferation resistance features. Now, both intrinsic features and extrinsic measures are essential, and they shouldn't be considered sufficient by itself. For example, I know over the past decade or so, I've seen things in the popular press and even in the technical press, and people have proposed different designs and have stated that, well, this design intrinsically is proliferation resistant. So whatever nuclear materials are being used, the reactor itself, the back end, all of this, they consider it, well, it's impossible to take this design and proliferate. Now, if you take a look at any nuclear reactor of any kind, there are proliferation features in them. There's a certain amount of proliferation resistance, but there's always features that have to be taken care of by extrinsic measures. And by extrinsic measures, we're taking a look at safeguards. So neither can be sufficient by itself. You wouldn't want to design a system that has to depend totally on safeguards for proliferation resistance, because if it's so easy to take that material and misuse it, and you have to depend totally on safeguards, that may be an unattractive system for a state to have, especially when its neighbors look at that and they may be worried about misuse of it. And the same thing, as I just mentioned, in intrinsic measures. There has to be a balance, and there has to be a assessment of these features to make sure that you have a proliferation resistant system. Now we have a framework for assessment for proliferation resistance. As I noted, that the features have to be such that the system stays unattractive throughout the life cycle. And we have 5 user requirements, states' commitments. And as I'm sure you've seen over the course of this week, you have to have a state committing to nonproliferation. And for example, the Republic of Korea has very strong commitment to NPT and international safeguards. These institutions are in place. In fact, Young has been involved with safeguards for a long time, and very important person who makes sure that the Korean institutions are strong. Now, you basically takes a look at this intrinsic nature of the technology and the nuclear materials, and UR3 takes a look at the safeguards and how do you implement safeguards in such a system, and how do you evaluate this balance. And UR4 we kept in there because we want to have multiple measures, defense and depth, in both sides, and intrinsic and extrinsic. And then we also want to have UR5, optimized proliferation resistance, so things are optimized throughout the cycle. So we developing our updated manual to reflect this. And I really tried to put an emphasis on UR2. And some people wanted to remove UR2. They thought, well, you can just take a look at, say, Nuclear Suppliers Group and the use of technology and how it's being moved between countries. I felt we still need to evaluate nuclear material attractiveness and keep people's eyes focused on that, and the science and the physics and the engineering behind that, such that you recognize that you have to understand the risk of certain materials. So when we get into the 3S, I've found that this diagram, which Zhoshan Choi, who used to be at Livermore, he put this out in a meeting about 10 years ago. In fact, I was in a meeting just recently with him, and he was very excited that I was still using this diagram, because he feels it's very graphic and it shows people the balance of the three S. So here you're balancing safety, security, and safeguards. For example, release of radiation. Now, on the security side, it could be intended. It could be a terrorist act. It could be a act by malevolent operators in the plant. Or on the safety side of it, could be an unintended accident, such as at Fukushima. Then you take a look at what they consider the inalienable right to nuclear technology that people see as enframed in the new Nonproliferation Treaty. Peaceful use, you see that on the safety side, peaceful use, but also dual use. There's technologies that have dual use. You can make power or you can produce plutonium. You can enrich uranium to use it in a reactor, or you can enrich uranium to a level to use it in a weapon. So you have to have this balance of safeguards there. And then on the other side of weaponization, terrorists misusing nuclear materials and taking it, or the host state. So one side of that is security, taking a look at what's going on by non-state actors, and then the safeguard looking at what's going on by the host state. So there's a very important concept to try and show the balance, and how do you balance these effectively so that you don't make one very strong but damage the others. For example, taking a look at accidents, and how do you balance these things? And now, of course, there's a new thing to worry about in security. We have the idea of security threats involving radioactivity. Well, of course, now we have these issues in Zaporozhye with the attack in March 2022, and there's some more things in the news recently about having weaponry and artillery being used at the plant, so that if somebody attacked it, they would damage the plant. So it's becoming a new worry that people hadn't thought about so much, or kind of put to the side. So you worry about these bad actor type accidents. And then, of course, then those are just accidents that have occurred, basically Three Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. And then there's the thing that makes it difficult there is the safety side, you want to have openness, transparency, and you're looking at design-based accidents. On security side, you want to have confidentiality, control information, design-based threats. So the balance of what you would want to expose to other people with respect to information can be contradictory. So you have this tug of war between security and safety. And with safeguards and security, there's also some issues. Okay, what's with the state and what's with the outside operators? Same thing with the safety and security. As I talked about earlier, some people want to focus on import-export control. Figure that's how we can control proliferation resistance, because we control who has material, who has the technology, and safeguards prevent dual use of nuclear technology such that it's being misused. But on the safety side, have peaceful use in a framework where everything's being done safely and securely. But with the code of conduct, safeguards by design versus safety government. How do we balance these things? So we look at this in an overall effort. We talked about safeguards by design. We talked about the INPRO methodology. One of our key efforts right now is this SMR NESA, Nuclear Energy System Assessment. And we have the concept of sustainable development, the need for sustainable energy supply. Shannon talked about that and how important that is. And then we get into performance of an energy system, planning on regional, national, global level, covering all energy sources. The definition of the role of nuclear and also fusion. We're starting to think about that, even in INPRO, sustainable energy mix. So we have three designs we're looking at the NESA right now using the holistic INPRO methodology. And one of them is the SMART design. The other is our ITM 200M from Russia. And the other is the CAROM design from Argentina. So the idea is evaluating the INPRO methodology, looking at the manuals and looking at whichever piece you want to look at, safety, economics are usually the most desired ones by the assessors. But we also want to try and push proliferation resistance now that we've upgraded it because we think it's an important concept. So then you identify follow-up actions. So follow-up actions could be moving into an area of safeguards by design, safety security safeguards by design, of reevaluating your design, taking into account the assessment of pro. And in fact, if we apply our methodology with 3S, I would say we're going to look at proliferation resistance with its user requirements, safety with its basic principle and user requirements. Safety is to have that the planned nuclear installation is superior to reference design. For example, if we look at SMART, we want to say that SMART is superior to previous nuclear power plants with respect to safety. Now, as an infrastructure, we should be able to have a design that can be integrated into the energy system and other nuclear energy options in the country. And we've integrated physical protection and security in the evaluation of infrastructure. So if you did an evaluation of those three, you should have some things that could help you out with respect to safeguards by design and safety, security, and safeguards by design. That's kind of a message that I'm trying to script and create for INPRO moving into the next decade, now that we have our updates in our manual and we've learned a lot over the 20 years of INPRO. Another big thing I think you should know about is we have an SMR platform collaborations in IAEA. The Director General has set up this platform, and as you can see, it's a real cross-cutting effort. We engaged with Department of Safeguards, Department of Nuclear Energy, Department of Nuclear Safety and Security, technical cooperation, and legal affairs. I said, well, what does all this have to do with SMRs? Well, technical cooperation is looking at a lot of, say, newcomer countries, and they're looking to have perhaps SMR because it fits their energy scaling. And then if we contact the platform, then we can see who to engage from the rest of the agency. Same thing with safeguards. Safeguards would then know that, oh, those people are looking at trying to do an SMR, maybe we can assist them with safeguards. And legal affairs has been very important to us because we're getting into advanced and unique type reactors. I know that our previous speaker talked about marine applications. There are probably a lot of issues with respect to safeguards that we really haven't had to think about because the ships that ran by nuclear weapon states that were nuclear were two from non-nuclear weapon states, from Germany and Japan, but that was basically in the pre-NPT era, the pre-safeguards INCIRC 153 era. So nobody was really thinking about how to safeguard them. Now that becomes an issue, and also the idea of floating nuclear power plants. And legal people can make sure that on the global scale and a national scale, that the institutional arrangements and regulations are in place, and that the designers are thinking about them from the beginning, because if not, you're going to design something that's absolutely unlicensable, untransportable, unusable. So we figure it's a crucial focal point for our three SPD issues: proliferation, resistance, and physical protection, which we're involved in the GIF group, and I've been the representative to that. And we've been very supportive and work together in a lot of tasks. We help them and they help us. And there's a concern for the designs and deployment to assist in making sure not to promote them in a type of choose one design over another, but to take a design and look at where the gaps are and help, and being able to help them and other designers be able to reach the use of innovations to get SMR deployment goals. So in conclusion, three things I want to emphasize. We've done this methodology update in the Proliferation Resistance Manual. It was a contribution from global selection of the subject area experts. It's a broad audience, expertise gained from inviting consultancy. We've had almost 10 consultancies, I believe now. And we've really focused down, and we have the manual rewritten, and I think it'll be much easier, more concise manual for people to use. And we're hoping to get people to come on board and take a look at that with respect to their design. It's a real consensus, and I feel very confident that it'll have use in the future. SPD 3 SPD, our safety and security people are on the lead on that. We're working with them, and I've done things for them. They've done things for me, and we're very enthusiastic about moving ahead. And we're emphasizing SPD and cross-cutting issues and partnerships. We're not trying to stake out a piece of an issue and say that's only nuclear energy's issue, that's only INPRO's issue, and keep your hands off. We're trying to build the collaboration and the partners here and out of the house. And the SMR platform, the idea is that to be able to focus and be a clearinghouse of ideas and issues in the agency, so that all the way up to the Director General, there's an understanding of SMRs because of just how much interest has been in that area, that we're on top of what's going on there, and we can be of assistance to the member states. So I'd like to thank you, and Gamsa Hamnida. I'm not so good at Korean, but I really like to thank Dr. Yin, Ms. Lee, the speakers today. It's always a pleasure to be involved in NEREC, and a great intellectual experience to work with all of you. So with that, I return to Ms. Lee.
Okay, thank you, Brian. But you should not go because we still have discussion session. But now we will move to
I'm
our...
going to unshare.
Okay. Yeah, we will move to our next...
I've unshared, so back to the...
Okay. Okay, next speaker is Dr. Mansung Im. Mansung Im is Donald E. Bentley and Agnes Buzinska Endowed Chair Professor of Nuclear and Quantum Engineering, Associate Vice President of the International Office, Head of Office of Global Initiative, Director of Center for Global Strategies and Planning, and Director of NEREC at KAIST. I don't need to go further. I think you all know about Dr. Im. So floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman, for your generous introduction. So this is the last talk of this session, talking about the future of nuclear power and the role of innovation. So I'd like to give some remarks based on what we already heard, sort of wrapping them up in a big picture perspective. This nuclear power started with the speech given by President of the United States in 1953. But then if you remember what happened at the time was United States, the whole world didn't mean to open this to the global community. It was not designed, or it was not even planned that this technology becomes available and accessible to the global community. This technology was developed as part of a war, and the technology was meant to overpower the enemy, end the world, and be done with it. That was the original plan. But then, as we all know, the technology was already out of the genie was already out of the bottle. We couldn't put it back. And the technology was already spreading. So, all the scientists, engineers, experts who came as part of the Manhattan Project were returning to the country, and not only they were keeping their knowledge, but they are spreading the knowledge, and then become part of the nuclear weapons development in their respective home countries, as well as development of this technology for peaceful use, energy generation. That was already happening, and USA saw this and then realized this is going to be potentially a big problem. So there are other reasons, but then USA government came up with this Atoms of Peace initiative. Now we open this technology to the global community. Whoever makes promise to the regulations and rules that we set up, we open this to you. That's how we started this technology, 1953. And then from 1953 and on, for the next ensuing maybe 20, 30 years, many countries joined the bandwagon. They wanted to be part of this development. At that time, nuclear power was perceived to be really the high-tech, something that everybody wanted in terms of the economic development, technical prowess, demonstration, and the promise of abundant energy, and etc. So many countries started the journey toward the development of nuclear technology, and the list here shows 53. And then I'm showing the different colors on the slide. The color black means they now have operating nuclear power plant. The color blue, or bright blue, are the ones who use this opportunity to develop nuclear weapons. And the ones with asterisk, the star, means these countries along the way try to pursue nuclear proliferation. In other words, they had a dual-use purpose. They tried dual track, both developing civilian side of the technology as well as military side of the technology. And as you can see also from this slide, there are many reds. These red countries who started their effort to develop nuclear technology but was not able to. And as of even today, they don't have the power. They don't have the technology of nuclear energy. So what does this mean? We had problems. As I said at the beginning, we didn't mean to start this thing. There was no norm or global governance for the support of global development for this technology. There were no really strong norm available out there. And also there is no real good system out there for nuclear non-proliferation, which was the main concern at the time as far as the development of this system, United States was concerned. As we know, and many of you are aware now, that the current global non-proliferation regime is a patchwork over the years based on what happened in 1960s and 70s and Indian explosion, Gulf War, and then all the export issues, and what happened with terrorism, and now with Ukraine war, and all this now adding different colors and complexities to the use of this technology. And we may be better off now, but we started without really having a system. We didn't know what it means to have nuclear power. There was no clear understanding of what is required to be successful in developing this technology. There are many things that countries need to be prepared for to be able to be successfully execute this project and have a successful operating nuclear power program. No expectation, no preparation, no guidelines. And to support this very complex technology, there has to be a good support from the national system in terms of regulating. The safety of the system has to be provided and maintained. And that was also lacking. And obviously, many countries, as we saw from this slide, had a dual-use purpose. And that dual-use interest led into the development of weapons along the way, including many countries. If we have time, we may like to go back and see what happened in each and every specific cases, but obviously we're not going to do that here. At the same time, we know that it was not easy to develop a successful nuclear power program. That means there is a huge risk involved in managing this technology. As many of you, some fellows understand the risks associated with nuclear power. It's risk of finance, operations, maybe even the public acceptance, the social risk, government support, government commitment, and then market risk, the financial risk, strategic risk, security risk, safeguard risk, just list goes on and on. There are huge risks associated with this technology, and industry, the government were not ready to deal with all these risk issues associated with this technology. So now we're talking about second wave, potentially a second wave of atoms of peace. As we heard from many speakers, this nuclear power is now receiving a spotlight. given the need for low carbon energy system, global climate change, and energy security, driven by the need for, awaken the need for energy security, we heard from these speakers during this conference. So are we ready now for this new potential second wave? A letter written by a globally leading environmentalist, you can see on the list, really truly global leading scholars on environmental protection, conservatist, writing the need for the use of nuclear power, especially sent to environmentalists, in other words, anti-nuke community. Hey, if you want to really achieve what you want to achieve, we have to rely on nuclear power. So that's good. I mean, nuclear power really is now receiving spotlight and then really needs to play a role. In other words, now nuclear power has to deliver. There is a publication by a group of scientists, scientists at Institute for Safety and Risk Science in Vienna, Austria. So they have a paper published in Energy Policy 2021 titled Nuclear Energy, the Solution to Climate Change with question mark. We all talk about greenhouse gas emission, carbon reduction, but then the authors are arguing the point. Will nuclear power deliver in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Their answer is no. According to what they have analyzed, at present, the way that nuclear power is projected to be used, the global community may be able to reduce the greenhouse gas emission annually by 2 or 3%. Looking at announced plans for new nuclear builds and lifetime extension, this value would not even increase due to the lifetime extension and then potential shutdown of many of the plants we have been running. And then substantial expansion of nuclear power will not be possible because of technical obstacles and limited resources and potential carbon emissions as part of the real nuclear fuel cycle, etc. That's what the authors are arguing as part of the project. As part of the paper. So I use this paper as part of my homework when I teach energy policy at KAIST, and then ask students to argue this point. I'm going to ask same thing to many of you. But then here is publication on greenhouse emission, the latest data on the global scene. 74% of greenhouse gas carbon emission comes from energy sector. Is there really a promise for nuclear power or to be able to better contribute to greenhouse gas reduction? Otherwise, what we hear a lot about nuclear power and its promise is not going to be realized or will not be, it will be a futile promise. Based on what we examined as part of that class I talked about, energy policy class, students had come up with an sort of an estimate. Depending on how we use nuclear power in industry, transport, energy use in buildings, nuclear power could contribute up to 20-25% reduction in total emission of greenhouse gas. So that's up to us. 20-25% maybe not enough, but still it's a significant contribution. So how can we get there? We already heard from Shannon. She is leading the US effort in integrated energy system development from the US side. We have heard from Dr. Lim, who is also leading the Korean effort, Korean Atomic Energy Research Institute National Labs effort in developing system like this. There are many players out there in the world doing this. But then basically, now we have to think about really a paradigm shift. Nuclear power initially was just proposed as a way to produce electricity. That was it. Now we have to think about a different way of using nuclear power to make really things happen for the future, for sustainable future. So nuclear power should be beyond electricity generation. Nuclear power, the biggest challenge we have is social challenge, as many of you know, and financial challenge. how can we overcome the social, political challenge associated with this technology? I think main issue is safety, if not estimated risk of nuclear power. It's the perceived risk of nuclear power. How can we effectively address that issue? I suggest the term fail-safe nuclear safety, something that anybody can understand and agree as part of a campaign for public acceptance of nuclear power. We also talked about the fact that when the nuclear industry in the world started this development, we didn't even know much about radiation health effects. Now, 2020, we have a much better idea about the radiation health effects, the risk associated with. We talked about the risk associated with the genetic risk and hereditary effects of radiation. We have now a lot better, much more actually advanced knowledge about the risk of nuclear power or radiation. So we have a potentially new ball game we can start with if we can fresh start again. We heard from this morning from Professor Bong-Gun, when KIDO project, countries try to develop technology and then export to nuclear North Korea, the commercial nuclear power. Dr. John said North Korea simply could not handle it in terms of greed as well as the national capability. They simply cannot buy insurance. As many of you know, when nuclear power industry was starting, they couldn't find a market. There's no market. So government had to create a market, in the case of USA. And therefore, government to create a market, the industry has to be convinced. But they were not convinced because they had no idea at the time what is the maximum credible extent and consequence of nuclear power. And government had to come up with an amendment to Atomic Energy Act. They had a Price-Anderson Act saying, okay, industry, you just buy 60 million insurance, and then we will cover the 500 million for you if anything bad happens. So there was what you call Price-Anderson Act. And similar things happen with the other countries. Any maximum credible extent occurring during the course of your operation, we as a government will cover it. That becomes the cap or safety for many of the industries to jump in as part of the financial risk management. Now, can all the countries out there can afford to buy this insurance? I think we need to have a better system, a global system, if we really thinking about using nuclear power global strategy for carbon emission reduction. We talked about safeguard issues. So the current non-proliferation regime is a patchwork, in a true sense. Over the years, we changed it or improved it because of many of the instances, problems we experienced. Now, can we start all over with a better system? I call something like fail-safe nuclear safeguard. Can we come up with a system that is fail-safe? And many of us are now aware that IAEA is potentially under stress with potentially large number of newcomers coming in. Can the international system handle it? And then also financial risk associated with this issue. And obviously the biggest challenge also industry knows is the waste management, spent fuel management. Some people even believe that there is no solution to waste problem, although that is not true. But then that is still remaining as a daunting task for anybody who wants to embark a journey onto this. So I think we already heard from our previous speaker, nuclear power beyond electricity generation. I think Chairman Kim earlier pointed out this cogeneration. I put some numbers there. There are already 19 units of nuclear power doing desalination, 43 units doing district heating, 7 units industrial heat process, heat application, and so on. So, but then that was old days. These plants were very old. They were designed for very specific market need. But then that's something we can do beyond electricity generation. And we already heard that hydrogen production is important and necessary, especially if nuclear power wants to be a contributor in terms of carbon reduction for transportation sector and maybe beyond that. Energy storage is an essential part of future energy grid. We kind of talked about this also as part of our class discussion. Without energy storage, this futuristic energy grid, a smart grid, is simply a dream. But then the current financial costs associated with energy storage technologies, simply it's an impossibility. So can we solve this conundrum? If nuclear power can serve as a huge energy storage device in an economic way, then it can really become a game changer. So can we do that? Yeah, the answer is yes, there is a possibility. Bill Gates is betting big time on this one. TerraPower is meant to be an energy storage system with large generating capacity. And then renewable and then nuclear energy, hybrid energy system as part of the smart grid or futuristic energy system. I put just some slides for especially those NEREC fellows who are not engineers. So nuclear power plant is, as you know, is a basically boiler using nuclear energy. And then you generate that heat and then run, basically produce steam and then use that steam to run the turbine, right? So you run turbine, you have all this steam. Instead of just using that steam to just run the turbine, you can extract some of the steam, you have energy, and then use that steam for whatever. That's basically the idea. Nuclear power can be beyond electricity generation. I will skip through this. I will also skip through this because Shannon already talked about hydrogen production in a very detailed way. So hydrogen production is definitely a possibility, even with the current technology, the low energy, low temperature electrolysis process. I personally done some project with KHNP on the financial feasibility of using current fleet of nuclear power plant for low temperature hydrogen production system. And the answer is, at least for the production level, nuclear power can be competitive with the alternative technologies. This renewable hybrid energy system is something that Idaho National is leading the global effort, and number of projects are going on under that, and number of scientists, investigators are examining this issue as well as the possible grid issues. I myself also very interested in working on this issue. So this is also a paradigm shift. Many of the electrical engineers, grid system engineers are not aware of nuclear power can become part of this smart grid system. Obviously, by using SMR, it definitely helps. But using even the large reactors, the current large reactors, we can still make this thing happen, depending on how you couple the renewable energy with small nuclear power plant. It could be loosely coupled or closely coupled, thermally coupled, but then depending on how you couple it, even the current fleet of large reactors can be part of this renewable system. How can we achieve the fail-safety nuclear power? Well, I think bottom line is you eliminate the possibility of severe damage to the reactor system. Thus, the release of radioactive materials from external to the atmosphere is basically eliminated. That's the goal. Even if the worst situation happens, that doesn't lead into the release of radioactive materials. So literally, you don't have a need for emergency protection zone. Can that be possible? I think technically, the scientists, engineers have already demonstrated that is possible. In other words, the severe accident, co-meltdown accident will not happen because of inherent safety design, the passive safety system, and then reliable the system associated with all this. So that is technically possible. But then one thing associated with this is by the way, I put this slides at the last minute, so I don't have a very complete, elaborate slides. So bear with me. The issue of public acceptance. Can public accept or agree or understand this issue? I think that the Chulmin Kim earlier, who asked a question to the earlier speaker, we did a study on the perception of public on the safety of nuclear power. And we found that if this system, especially SMR, can go underground, there could be a significant impact on public acceptance of nuclear power. So there is a possibility that public can have a different way of looking at nuclear power depending on how you design, depending on how you deploy. That, I think, can potentially open a new dialogue with the public. In terms of fail-safe nuclear safeguards, many of the things that, Brian from IAEA talked about, and then many of the SMR already comes with this very innovative features in terms of safety, security. But also I argue that there could be something called passive safeguard system that needs to be developed. In other words, if anything goes wrong, if there is any sign of misuse, In fact, we have such a advanced information control technology, communication technology available now. This emergence of advanced ICT technologies, you can detect what is going on. With the big data, IoT, all these things can allow the detection of misuse of suspected behavior, suspicious behavior, and that could lead into system shutdown. System basically shuts down and no more access to the nuclear materials. That can be possible. Something we didn't just think about in the past, but now maybe for the future, that should be considered. In terms of system civil liability issue, I think currently IAEA is the depository of a legal system for the Vienna Convention and the joint convention between Paris and then Vienna, and then what we call supplementary convention, additional countries who needed more liability coverage. But then I think that has to be expanded. In other words, we really have to come up with a system that can be applied to any newcomer country. Maybe IAEA is leading, and then many countries, especially exporter countries, becoming part of this development, and then coming up with a system. If you import nuclear power, you automatically become a member of the system, and you have to pay a minimum membership. But then you're covered in terms of the civil liability issue for the nuclear damage. That's something we should really seriously think about. I already mentioned this safeguard issue. I think we have seen this slide already somewhere before. But then we have this sort of projection, how much additional expenditure is required to cover the potential increase in the safeguard cost, and that cost is going to increase. So who is going to cover? And we already, I think, had a discussion on this one. It has to be covered by exporters and importers. The current system doesn't require that. I think IAEA and the global community, especially export and importer community, has to agree on this issue so that polluter pays, or the customer pays, or whoever export the system pays. We have to have a new system, new way of looking at this issue. I think in terms of financial risk, based on the experiences and lessons learned, I think countries have come up with different creative models. I think we talked about the possibility of maybe distributing the risk over the years. I think, for example, regulated asset model that UK has come up with, the consumers are paying from the beginning while the construction is underway. That way, the risk of construction is not all upon the developer or the owner of the plant. Before they start generating revenue, basically they have to pay all this huge debt and the financial cost. We can relieve that. Also, we can think about a way potentially doing some sort of a crowdfunding. I think we have now very innovative models out there. In terms of renewable energy development, the community has come up with very creative ideas for the funding, basically equity development, equity model, investment development. So I think we could do something similar, very similar to the development of nuclear power, especially with SMRs, because SMRs, the capital cost requirement is very low. I think the lessons we learned from Korea and China needs to be very shared. I think China is aiming at reducing overnight construction cost below $3,000 per kilowatt. South Korea has achieved the overnight construction cost below 3,600 already. I think these are very, very important measures. And the way they are able to come up with this cost is because of very efficient management as well as very strong support of supply chain. And I think in the future development should be based on the sharing knowledge and expertise on this issue, and then should be able to maintain that performance, maybe through the collaboration in the global community. In terms of spent fuel management, it's a huge challenge. So far in the back-end fuel cycle, we don't have a multilateral system. But again, without any responsible system ready and available, having many of the countries jumping in this business and then asking them to be responsible for waste management and spent fuel management, I think it's irresponsible. Who has an operating nuclear waste repository right now? Nobody. Finland is going to have one, maybe this year. Sweden may have something soon. But it took 50, 60, 70 years for the global industry to have one single operating nuclear waste repository. So I think the global community really needs to seriously think about developing a multilateral facility. I put potentially a controversial slide there. China, Russia working potentially, and then Western exporters working together, or maybe even they all working together, coming up with something that could be used as a multilateral facility for the global customers. We haven't thought about this significantly or seriously because of conflicting or competing interest amongst the exporters. But if we are really serious about the global expansion and sharing this technology for the global sustainable development, I think we need a serious discussion on this issue. I think my final slide, we already heard that we have to prepare for the future. The future will not repeat, hopefully, the past experiences. If we are ready or prepared, that preparation requires new paradigm in terms of risk management on many aspects. And then that also requires social political consensus among the parties, stakeholders involved. Unfortunately, for example, the grid system, the smart energy system, integrated energy system, that sounds great, and that's something of the future. But in the case of South Korea, if South Korea really wants to be serious and develop this smart integrated energy system, combining nuclear, renewable, and then other all energy sources in smart way, it takes $7 billion per year. Do we want to go for that? That requires social political consensus. That's just an example. But I think in many aspects, the future of nuclear power depends on social consensus we develop as country, as nation, or region, or global community. And I think future is up to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Im. Thank you for your presentation, and also thank you to generously allow us 10-minute break. We are already behind the schedule, but he allowed us 10-minute break, so we will meet again before our discussion. Thank you.
결론을 다 서머라이즈 하셨네요.
we will summarize all the questions and I will give 5 minutes to each our panelists. Is it okay? Okay, so we already have many questions, so please.
Yeah, thank you for your answers, professors. And I have one question to Tae-young Lim, professor, and one question to Man-sung Im, professor. First one, you talk about the smart, Korea's SMR, and I'm just curious, when I did the presentation in outside, and we just do how to improve our Kyoto Agreement for North Korean denuclearization. And I cannot remember, but one professor suggests Korea just start the research for smart to provide that one to North Korea. So I'm just curious how South Korea develop and change smart technology to give to North Korea. And also second question, Professor Man-sung Im talk about the nuclear liability, and also in the Kyoto Agreement, in the Kyoto Agreement there are liability articles, but it is not elaborated, so it is the one of the failure of the Kyoto Agreement. So I'm just curious, how can we solve this financial problem to support this nuclear liability issue? Thank you.
Thank you. And okay.
Hello. Hi. Good afternoon to all the speakers. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentations. I have a question just for anyone who wants to answer, because I think it's relevant to all the topics that were covered today. But we were talking about innovation and cooperation, and how, for instance, Dr. Lim was talking about SMRs, and how I personally think that this is a technology that we need to be able to deploy as soon as possible, since climate change is basically a race against time. But as we all know, there is still an imbalance in terms of the kind of knowledge and access to technology and expertise among developed countries and developing countries, such as my own. So it's kind of hard for countries like mine to catch up with all the new developments in nuclear technology, especially, I think. So since we are kind of at a deadline, how do we ensure that these new technologies can be disseminated to developing countries as fast as possible, and not just technology, but also knowledge and expertise, so that by the time that we need them, we'll be able to use them as soon as we can? Should the prerogative be, for instance, on the more developed countries to reach out to the developing countries, or should the developing countries be the one to ask for help? Or does the IAEA have the prerogative to build these kinds of networks, such as the SMR platform that Dr. Boyer was talking about earlier, in order to foster these kinds of connections? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you. I have 3 questions for each of the speakers. So my first question is for Dr. Boyer. Before that, I would like to thank Dr. Boyer for your reports and presentation on Google. So it helped me a lot. So I'm interested in SMR fabrication plants and potential newcomer countries, because if we load fuel in factory, seal and transport SMR, then there will be a tremendous amount of transportation. So it is a security concern. And on the other hand, if we load the fuel at the site, then IAEA should deal with all of the newcomer countries. So it is a safeguard problem. So as a private company employee, then I have a question for who should pay for it, or who should handle this problem? It is solely a country, or it is a developer should be included in this problem? So that is my first question. My second question is for Professor Man-sung Im, that how can private companies in SMR field work with government and public sector? to develop viable projects. So I think the companies have money and business mind for projects, but do not want to or hesitate to influence government's certain political decision related to nuclear power. So what will be the private sector's role in the future of nuclear power development? And the short last question for Dr. Sejong Lee. So how do you think about the economics and licensing of fourth generation reactors? So like KINS, when will KINS be ready for licensing fourth generation reactor in Korea? Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you. My name is Yeren Bu. I'm a research fellow for this year. I have a question to Professor Wansung Lim about nuclear energy. And you mentioned how this can be the potential solution for, in the future when we're trying to solve the climate crisis. But I think one of the largest obstacles that we may need to overcome is how nuclear energy and all sorts of energy transition in particular have become so politicized. So on the one hand, we have the politicization at the local level because people don't want these facilities in their neighborhood, right? And then we have the politicization in the ideological level, I guess, within a country and also between countries, because it can be a very hot topic, especially between countries with already existing animosity, such as Korea and Japan. So my question is, do you have any idea as to how to reframe or refocus the rhetoric into a more neutral way so that we could actually start using it for the better good? Thank you.
Thank you. If there is any more question, okay.
Thank you, and I'm Min Kim from South Korea, and I have a question towards Professor Mansung Im as well. And I guess towards the end, you talked about how social consensus is really important in not only in the international sphere, but also in the local domestic sphere in order for nuclear non-proliferation and for NPP to happen in our society. So regarding that, I think that social consensus not only come from the private part, but it's also heavily influenced by the government as well and the public sphere. So in that case, in the case of South Korea, our government changes every 4 years, and sometimes government have very different policies, as we can see from the Moon regime and also the current Yoon president as well. So in this case, how do you think that the government should actually help out in the situation, if there are any other alternatives in even the private sphere to help out and have a more, as the previous person have asked about having a very neutral atmosphere, or actually helping out to make that people are more interested in this topic.
Okay, thank you. I think it is enough, so we will stop here, and then I will give the floor to our panelists. So first one is Dr. Im, second Dr. Boyer, and then another Professor Im. Yeah, please go ahead.
In Korean pronunciation, Professor Im and my Lim is the same pronunciation. So well, I got some questions from this regarding SMART. Well, we had some investigations. This our investigation by institute. I mean internal investigation. We don't have any discussion with the government, but our internal investigation to modify those smart reactor to the barge-mounted types to supply to the North Korea. And the conclusion is it's too heavy to modify. So we should design much lighter way to using these smart technologies. And there are some ideas to using SMR instead of large plant to assist this North Korean electricity shortage problems, because they don't have enough grid to using those large plants. So basically, I believe SMR will be a good, options to, denuclearization, negotiation with the North Korea. And the second question is how this private business, how they can ensure they disseminate as quickly as possible to those imbalanced knowledges on nuclear technologies. I believe this we should encourage this private involvement to this nuclear business. Most of countries in the world, this nuclear business is led by the government side or public side, but that makes things very slow. So we observe this in the SMR business. It's led by private sectors. It is much faster. So if you want to introduce SMR in the developing countries as quickly as possible, then we should invite private companies to engage that kinds of business. And third question is this prospect of economics and the licensing possibilities in Korea regarding the SMRs. First, the licensability of SMR is very promising. We already got this smart license. We have some experience, and we have very close discussion with the KINS, Korea Institute of Nuclear Safety, about this design feature of ISMR, because we introduced very new features on the ISMR, which is new to regulators as well. So I believe we will have some knowledge shares, and probably I'm very optimistic to get a license of this water-based SMR. I mean the LWR type SMR, we don't have that much problems to get the license. And in case of non-LWR type SMR, well, Korean regulators has a few experience on that. So our strategy is to get license outside of Korea using this SFR in Canada and VHTR also in Canada or United States, and MSR from the other side of this Earth. I mean, these many shipbuilders and those private companies, they are interested in using this MSR, using container ships, and they already started to get some licensing process for this, some in terms of ship operations. So I think that's some sort of our tactics or strategies to start from outside and import those regulatory regimes to the Korean side. That's all right. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Boyer. Your turn.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lee. It was very interesting questions that were asked there, and I think that this is an area which I've been thinking a lot about recently, because we're actually having a meeting on Monday with some people from the outside to discuss floating nuclear power plants. And as we were talking, the question mentioned, there's several questions mentioned about, well, for one thing, developing countries. Now, with respect to the IAEA, we do have in our own division NIDS, which is the Infrastructure Development Section, and they do the INAR missions where they go and take a look at the infrastructure in the country, a lot of developing countries, whether they're ready for nuclear power. And one of the issues has been, we've seen countries come again, and we have to evaluate how serious they are. But with respect to the question, and I thought it was a good question, the countries are trying to get in. I think these vendor and suppliers now, with respect to small modular reactors, and even especially the idea of floating nuclear power plants, they could go by what's the BOO, build, own, operate model, where they would be building, owning, and operating. So for example, Republic of Korea, as Dr. Yim has mentioned, Republic of Korea has had an exemplary record in construction of being economic and on time. Certainly, you could develop the industry to be able to do build, own, and operate. Look at this, the record they had with the Emirates in a large power plant. So you get into that area, and also a floating nuclear power plant where you could move it in there and move it out. The question that was asked about responsibility. We have a task already called Transportable Nuclear Power Plant 2. We already had one. And in fact, if you're interested on a document that we've done, we have a document on legal and institutional issues of transportable nuclear power plants, a preliminary study. That was 2013, and you can look it up on the agency website, and it is available. You can purchase it, but much better than that, you can download it for free. And it is the preliminary study, but I've been involved in this, and those very issues that you were mentioning have come up. Who's responsible for safeguards? Who is going to pay for this? Agency access to facilities. The idea of a transportable nuclear power plant that's not opened up except at the factory or the refueling area is very, I think it is very palatable for a developing country because they don't have to deal with a lot of things. We have to develop a safeguards model to be able to handle safeguards where it's never opened except at the factory, and the factory is the third country. Those are things we beginning to think about in our next study. Hopefully we'll be able to discuss in more detail, because certainly the vendors have decided to push this model, and I think it could work. One of the things that came up, and this is a big issue, the institutional issues with respects to transport and safeguards. Who's in charge, and what are the transport rules? One of the things that came up is the idea, okay, we refuel on site. Immediately, somebody objected because they said, well, we can foresee the rules cover transporting a reactor fueled and back and forth. But once you try to refuel and have stored spent fuel on a barge, it's a different issue. And you can't transport spent fuel on a barge. So there are these gaps in how we look at things. And there's one student brought up there. Those are real issues. And in fact, I'm looking at some of these papers that were written by MIT, and they actually show a spent fuel pond in a floating nuclear power plant. How are we going to deal with that? We really need to look at that with respect to legal. That's why I talked about legal being very important in the SMR platform. When I was involved as a safeguards expert for the Transportable Nuclear Power Plant project, my eyes are very open to all these cross-cutting issues and how they play out in reality, and how well are we looking at them before we try and market a floating nuclear power plant. Now, right now, the Russian power plant, it's not a big issue because it's in one country. But if you get into a second country, and then of course there are other countries involved with respect to transport, it's going to be a real challenge. And in fact, we've talking to people talking about trying to run floating nuclear power plants in international waters. What are going to be the rules there? What about marine transport in the future? Because that was brought up by Dr. Lim, that especially Korea with its huge industrial capacity and shipyard capacity can play a big role there. And there are really some super challenges and very interesting issues there with respect to safeguards, security, safety, nuclear design, all things are very much, I think, for people who are interested in nuclear power and nuclear engineering, there are challenges in the future. So I hope I've at least tried to answer your question, but also given you more things to think about.
Thank you. Okay. Now.
I have 2 minutes with the target finish at 45. Well, first question about the KIDO project liability issue payment by North Korea. I think we can tie this thing with techno diplomacy with some of the discussion going on among the research group. Assuming that North Korea, I mean, we talked about this morning the potential challenge, denuclearization or deterrence. Basically assuming that North Korea realize that economic prosperity and keeping nuclear weapon doesn't go hand in hand. They have to come to a point with the realization that we may have to give up and that precondition is achieved, then we may be able to get what we want to achieve, want to get. So as part of the techno diplomacy, this liability payment by the supporters or exporters could be arranged. I think one group talking about techno diplomacy and what is the step, what are the conditions for each advancement in terms of providing aid. I think that could be part of this maybe, I think, consideration. Also, the question about joint technological development between the exporters and the importers, especially developing countries. I think it's a tough issue, but we have some models. For example, Saudi Arabia is developing smart technology, and they have sent their engineers to carry, and they have gone through 2 years of joint R&D or design studies. But then I think that sort of a model can be used for nation-specific, I think, issues or conditions with different arrangement for the support. And maybe IAEA can maybe even provide some support. So that's just a model. Whoever is exporting or developing that that reactor type, with the support from IAEA, you can develop this bilateral, maybe multilateral support. And engineers, experts from the respective countries can participate jointly in the process of design development. I think that way you learn from the beginning how the system works, how system should be designed, and how eventually system operates. I think that's an example. The question about the industry and private sector and working with government to basically develop a vibrant commercial sector. The good question also, but there is a precedent. I mean, basically an example in the history. When United States started this industry, there was no commercial sector. There was no viable industry or market out there. So Atomic Energy Commission, the government, combined with General Electric, Pacific Gas and Electric Company, they worked together to produce this first boiling water reactor, Ballastistos reactor, and the Westinghouse and Duquesne Nuclear Power, Duquesne Electric Utility Company worked together with Atomic Energy Commission, produced shipping port reactor, the first PWR. I think those models could be, I think, examined as a case for, I think, basically the project you're talking about. There are some maybe challenges, but I think basic model could be there in terms of how to fabricate maybe viable system. Samsung, GS Energy, Hyundai, GS, all SK, I think they're all interested in, and KINS, and then maybe even IAEA, or maybe some of the international regulators like USNRC or Canadian regulators. They are already ahead in terms of developing regulation for SMRs, so they can be part of this development as well. I think question from Yerin, how to collaborate and then really change the rhetoric in terms of developing, supporting the nuclear power. It's a tough question, but it is sort of related to the last question, how to develop social consensus in the use of nuclear power. It's a tough question, but maybe I will use a word, what I call participatory decision-making. In South Korea recently went through a big debate on whether the Shingori 5 and 6 nuclear power unit should be constructed. In other words, there was a pause, a halt of that project, and then Moon Jae-in government asked basically the committee and the people to examine this through public deliberation process, whether we can come up with a popular consensus on the fate of this plant. Eventually, the decision from the public committee was to resume the construction. I think that is an example. I think the key issue is nuclear power usually just top-down government mandate, but I think that doesn't no longer work in liberal democratic society. So we should now marry the participatory decision-making with government initiative, with industry and commercial sector support for the future development of nuclear power. I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I can see everyone wants to discuss more, but time is up. I thank our distinguished panelists and excellent listeners. Hereby, I adjourn this session. Thank you.
Now we getting into the last part of this conference. So we have two speakers for that part of this conference. First one is closing speech by Professor Dr. Sunung Cheng. Dr. Sunung Cheng is not physically here, but he will deliver his message on the screen. So Professor Sunung Cheng, he is truly the mentor or advisor or leader or designer or visionary for nuclear power industry in South Korea. He is the person behind South Korea's nuclear power technology development and the self-reliance and the sub-export. He was the mastermind behind all this development over the last, I think, 40 years and so on. Professor Sunung Cheng, he is a member of, he is a chairman of the National Committee on Safety and Security. He was also chair of the Advisory Committee on Nuclear Safety and Security for Korean Nuclear Safety and Security Commission. He was also International Advisory Expert Panel on investigation of Fukushima accident, the safety issues. And he was also Vice President and Provost of KAIST. And he was also trustee member of Korea Federation of Science and Technology Society. He is also chairman of the NEREC Advisory Board. Professor Sunung Cheng.
The closing remark at the 2022 NEREC conference. The world is now combating the climate change, and at the same time, the mankind is enduring a threatening energy crisis, especially after the Russian invasion to the Ukraine. The natural gas supply from Russia has been dramatically cut down to Europe, and the energy prices are continuing to mount up every day without cease. Several European countries already repowered the dormant coal power plant, and hence it's become much harder to achieve the net zero goal than before. As a carbon-free energy source, the world now is recognizing nuclear power as the most effective energy source for assuring the global energy security as well as achieving the carbon neutrality. However, to expand the nuclear power through a continuous operation of the existing nuclear power plant and rapid deployment of the advanced reactor, including Generation 3 plus and Generation 4 technology for both large and small medium reactors. You have many tasks to enhance the safety, economics, including supply, clean, security, and safeguard for nuclear power plant. Especially, you need to improve the economics of nuclear powers. You need a nuclear power plant, but I think in the most of country, nuclear power is expensive because of capital cost. Nuclear energy is the very low fuel cost, the high capital cost. High capital cost depend on the duration of construction time. That's why to cut down the price and to enhance the economy, you must make an effort to reduce the construction time and on budget. It's another thing I'd like to mention is the balanced approach. In the meantime, if you too much worry about the safety, and for example, you can delay the construction time or the delayed regulation, it hurt the economics. In the same way, too much worry about nuclear security and non-proliferation, the damage and the hurt energy security. So now, last 20, 30 years, European country, they didn't build a nuclear power plant because of nuclear security or non-proliferation, maybe for some way. But now, they are confronted with energy security problems. So that's why I like to emphasize again balanced approach between safety and economics, between security and non-proliferation, and energy security. For the purpose, the expansion of nuclear power should be combined with more active international effort, including nuclear non-proliferation, safety and pure supply, security than the past. Throughout the more frequent and open interaction among the international community, the knowledge on the nuclear technology is globally shared and also enhanced remarkably. More through the international collaboration for our nuclear effort, nuclear R&D, transparency on the nuclear security and non-proliferation will be significantly improved against the potential threat and risk. That's why I like to emphasize again, we need international collaboration for research and development. It will reduce the cost, it will increase the knowledge, it will increase the transparency. Okay, thank you very much.
So Dr. Cheng sent his personal regards. I forgot to mention, he's served 8 years as the president of Handong University as well. Now, the last truly closing remark will be delivered by Dr. Xiang'en Lee, the president of Sejong Institute.
Okay, here you are, finally, at the last moment of the conference. So have you really enjoyed this year's conference? Yeah, I also agree with you. I also learned a lot and really enjoyed with primarily young scholars of the next generation. Well, listening and past the 2 days conference, I believe we truly touched upon many important issues in nuclear non-proliferation and other related issues. It seems to me at least we can identify a few important themes of this year's conference. One is obviously increasing geopolitical risk. We talked about Ukraine crisis and how this geopolitical risk can negatively influence non-proliferation regime and other issues as well. Well, looking back at recent international relations, we already had witnessed many disrupting phenomena. Firstly, we had the COVID-19 pandemic. And on top of that, we already had the US-China strategic competition, which began before the pandemic. And now we have Ukraine, Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this multitudes of geopolitical risk is influencing policy of many countries in the world. So what's the direct impact of those geopolitical risks in non-proliferation regime? First of all, we talked yesterday that most of all, great power competition and rivalry will make cooperation on non-proliferation regime among great power will make that quite difficult in the future. Right now, NPT review conference is going on in New York, but I don't believe many people have very optimistic expectation about the outcome. And also, we are having TPNW in UN, but many people believe that in the near term, it will not have much chance to be successful. And also, recently, we are witnessing other regime meltdown phenomena. UN is not functioning well, WHO, WTO, and all those are some of the examples that recently global governance at global institutions, which is the set of the rule-based international order, does not function properly. But at the same time, we have one possible optimistic expectation. At least for the near term, we will have new opportunities for nuclear energy. We talked intensively about some innovation in nuclear power development. We talked about SMR particularly, and other related technologies. And also, we talked about Korea-US nuclear cooperation in foreign overseas market. And I think that these new opportunities was made possible by one very important policy, carbon neutrality or net zero policy, which has become quite important policy agenda in every country in the world. And also because of that, every nation is facing increasing needs for energy transition. So this is the part of the whole, the big theme and intellectual architecture that we have to think about in the coming years. But this new opportunity is not free, at least I think. So we have to think about what is a more proliferation resistance methodology to implement these new technologies. And just before a few minutes ago, we talked about 3S methodology when we also implement the new technology in SMR and other new methodologies in using nuclear energy. Another theme is obviously North Korean issue. I remember that for the past few conferences, I usually talked about North Korean issue, North Korean nuclear denuclearization, and also how can we work together to prevent further deteriorating North Korean nuclear situation. But it seems to me we had enough of the discussion about North Korean issue so far. But nevertheless, North Korea has a 7th nuclear test pending. And also, North Korea is continuing missile development and provocation. So it may be the time that we have to think about what is the right balance between deterrence and denuclearization. So it will not be an easy question. We have to think about continuously and discuss what is the best way to handle deterrence and denuclearization in the coming years. And I feel that in this area, most of the experts believe that given North Korea's 6th nuclear test and missile provocations, it is very unlikely that North Korea will give up their nuclear program in the short term. Then why do we have to continue this seemingly useless debate of denuclearization? Well, as a Korean, I want to live on a Korean peninsula which is nuclear weapon free. I believe my fellow Koreans will feel the same way. So I think this is the complete nuclear free Korean peninsula is a kind of a declarated policy of Korea, meaning that this is a constant reminder to North Korean regime that North Korea, okay, you may live with a nuclear weapon, but if you give it up, perhaps North Korean people's life may be much, much better than it is. So this is I think that's the kind of message that we have to continue to talk to North Korea. So overall, I believe this year's Keystone NEREC and Sejong conference is quite successful. And I believe this year's conference provided you enough thought for you to grow both in knowledge and personal network. So I urge you to continue to have a lot of attention and interest in nuclear non-proliferation and how can we best work together to enlarge and enhance our peaceful use of nuclear energy, and also a little bit on how can we work to denuclearize North Korea. So at the end of this conference, I really feel proud of all of you. I also enjoyed watching post session in outside hall, and also I hope that all of you in your own field to be a successful and priming the next generation expert in this area. So congratulations again, and I hope to see you next year. Thank you. This is the end of conference.
Although we are finished, we cannot just go home without recognizing those people who made this thing happen possible. First of all, I think Sejong Institute graciously allowed us to use this excellent facility, just ready-made for online, offline, hybrid conference for us, free. Of course, we as a joint host, but then. So again, thank you, Dr. Lee and President. And also, I think the staff members of Sejong Institute, as you noticed, they've been working last 2 days. You know, this week, this is a holiday here at Sejong. So they came out during this holiday to support this conference. So the people who are working behind this high-tech equipment, we really appreciate all of you. If you can stand up just quickly. Thank you. And then we have this excellent admin assistant staff behind the scenes, making everything possible, including lunch and everything, even cleaning up lunch boxes. Let's thank, I think they're the leaders of admin staff. And of course, we have NEREC staff, Yunhwa, and then Ji-eun, Samir. As you know, they are behind everything. And also, I have to mention this, that we will be publishing their conference report, an annual report, basically providing all the summaries of what happened during the last 2 days. And people among the audience have worked very hard to make that happen. They're working as a rapporteur to provide a summary of these sessions and then eventually make it as part of the report. So Nazarene, raise your hand or stand up. Victor, Jung-eun, Joel, Edjoa, Cecilia, Daria, Kerbin, Kayoung, Hanyoung, Sugyung, and lastly, Hannah. And she's doing 6 presentations. Truly appreciate your support and support behind the scenes. Thank you. Any logistic announcement?
The bus is waiting for you.
To enjoy the rest of the day, we're going to Namsan. And again, thank you, Sejong. Thank you, Dr. Lee and all the staff. And then Professor Steve Miller. Just quietly watching this. Only international speaker with us for the last 2 days. Truly appreciate your support as well. Thank you. I hope you all join us in the next couple of hours. Yes, Victor.
And Professor Yim as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.